This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 474 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. This show is about the process. I refuse to just give you a list of players that I like and don't like in a given week or a given year and say, trust me. The substance is what matters. It allows whoever's listening to the show to really understand the why. And when you understand the why, you can win in fantasy football more consistently. It's like the old saying goes, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. I hope you've learned to fish by listening to this podcast. But as is the case if you go fishing, you'll have some bad days with fantasy football. It's not easy predicting the future. It's definitely not easy predicting the future about the outcome of a small sample size game. But I don't make excuses as an analyst. Even though it's impossible to get everything right, maybe that's an excuse, I still try to be right as much as possible. But inevitably, things don't always go the way that I thought things would go. And that's what this episode is all about each year. I look at the things that didn't go my way. To put it more bluntly, I look at the things that I got wrong. Why? Because I think it's important. It keeps me honest. It shows you guys that I'm on this journey with you. I'm not trying to hide from my mistakes. I'm trying to get better from them. So today I'll be walking through my biggest misses of the 2020 fantasy football season. I'll talk about what the miss was, why I thought the way that I did, and whether or not there was bad process involved. Next week, then, I'm going to look at things that went my way. I've got to start with this one, though, so you guys know that I'm not just sitting here patting myself on the back. Now, before I crap all over my bad picks, the conference championship games are happening this weekend, and you should check out FanDuel before those games happen. Because over on FanDuel, you can enter the NFL Sunday Million for just $4.44. The winner of the contest will walk away with $300,000. So head over to FanDuel.com, enter today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Let's kick things off with the worst take of my season, and that was more or less fading Stefon Diggs. In hindsight, it just seems egregious. And it was pretty egregious. I was flat out wrong. And honestly, this is one of the pieces of advice where I'm pissed at myself for the logic that I used. It was just dumb. The logic with not going hard after Stefon Diggs was as follows. The Bills entering the year had 2 straight seasons of being a pretty run-heavy offense. With Josh Allen and Brian Dable, the Bills had ranked 31st and 20th in neutral script pass rate, and they were 29th and 26th in overall pass rate. They threw the ball 499 times and 513 times. If they threw the ball even just a little bit more than that, you were looking at bad odds for Diggs to finish as a wide receiver 1. Because over the 5 years prior to this one, 17% of teams had seasons with fewer than 500 attempts. Only 4% of wide receiver 1 seasons came from those teams. And 30% of teams threw it 525 or fewer times. And just 11.5% of wide receiver 1 seasons came from those teams. Meanwhile, in a similar environment, or a similar projected environment back in Minnesota, Diggs had finished just 1 year as a wide receiver 1 in points per game. And then on top of that, Diggs had some regression coming from a yards per target standpoint. And that yards per target regression definitely hit. He went from a rate of 12 to 9.2. The problem is that the volume went in the opposite direction. Buffalo went from being this run-heavy team to being the 8th pass-friendliest team in neutral game scripts this year. They ranked 11th in pass attempts and 10th in team targets. And Diggs finished the season with a 29% target share. So not only was the idea that Buffalo wouldn't be pass-heavy wrong, but then Diggs saw a huge chunk of that passing pie. And here's the thing. Here's the takeaway that I really screwed up on. Because projections are going to be wrong. But it honestly didn't make that much sense that I felt this way about Stefon Diggs, and then I was out here touting DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Because it was the same logic. What I loved about Metcalf and Lockett was that they were being priced as if the Seahawks were going to continue to be this run-heavy team. But what happened if they didn't? All of a sudden, there was a massive ceiling for both of those players. And the same should have been said for a talent like Stefon Diggs. It's not as though I hate the talent. He's amazing. He's always been amazing. It's just that the environment didn't appear to be great. But it's not like his ADP reflected a top-tier environment. That's why I'm so mad. Because the process for this take in particular should have been avoided. The learning here is something I've tried to incorporate, but it's that if a team level projection and that team level environment, if that doesn't appear to be favorable and it's driving down the cost of an objectively good player, you should probably buy, not sell. In a worst case scenario, he likely just meets ADP since he's still a good player. And like I said, that's the logic I use for the Seahawks wideouts. So it's a complete whiff to not have used that same logic for Diggs. It was arguably the biggest miss anyone could have had at wide receiver this year. It got me. I also wasn't very high on Keenan Allen this season, but I think this one is a little bit more forgiving than the Diggs one. Again, this was never about talent. Keenan Allen, he's an incredible player. It was more that the quarterback situation, it scared me. You had Tyrod Taylor, which I think we could all agree that Allen's season wouldn't have been nearly as good if Tyrod Taylor was under center throughout that season. Our only sample is week 1, and in week 1, Allen had 7 PPR points on 8 targets. Of course, we should have never assumed that Tyrod Taylor would start all year. Some weird circumstances hit to where Justin Herbert was forced to start, but Taylor likely wasn't going to be the starter throughout the entire season. And I talked about this before the season when talking about Keenan Allen. Number 1, Allen was playing without Phillip Rivers for the first time in his career. And over his last 3 seasons, in each season, he had hit at least a 26% target share. Because that number was so consistently high, it wasn't a lock for him to be that high with a new quarterback. That was the first thing. But also, rookie quarterbacks generally don't produce high-end fantasy receivers. Only 9% of rookie quarterbacks, according to a study done by Sharp Football Analysis' Rich Rebar, only 9% of them also produced a wide receiver 1 in fantasy since the year 2000. And not a lot of them had wide receiver 2s either, at just 29%. Keenan Allen was never bad. That wasn't the reason for not aggressively going after him in fantasy drafts this year. It was more so the environment that wasn't just based on how the offense would call plays. There was more to it than that. It was based on a below-average quarterback in Tyrod Taylor combined with an up-in-the-air rookie quarterback. And I had no strong feeling about Justin Herbert. I generally have a wide range of outcomes when it comes to my quarterback evaluation. But he ended up hitting. And that really helped Allen finish as the wide receiver 6 in PPR points per game this season. Back in July, I was into Keyshawn Vaughn. This is another one of those, how in the world was that your take kind of takes. Now keep in mind, this was before he was on the COVID list. This was before the team signed Leonard Fournette. This feels like years ago, but it was a month and a half before the season started. In hindsight, it was a really bad call. But I do think there were pieces of the Keyshawn Vaughn touting that was right. The first one being that I was targeting an ambiguous backfield. Ronald Jones and Dare Ogunbowale were the 2 running backs in that backfield at the time. And neither had high ADPs. That's one of the keys in finding true breakout running backs. Jones, who was the projected primary early down runner, he wasn't much of a receiver. He's never been a receiver. And typically, breakout running backs are pass-catching backs. At the time, the thought was that Keyshawn Vaughn could take that on, especially considering he had one of the best final season reception shares in the 2020 running back class. He just didn't pan out. Lots of things worked against him entering the season, to be fair. But in the end, if he was good enough, he likely would have been on the field. That's going to happen. And to be honest, I'd do it all again. Because when you get into the middle and the late rounds of your drafts, the opportunity cost is getting lower. It's getting a lot lower. If a guy doesn't pan out, it's not the end of the world. I'm also not totally giving up on Vaughn. I think he's a good player. But the chance that he really pans out, it's really low given how his year 1 went. Like I always say, good players generally perform. They show up. When a rookie doesn't at all, that's a red flag. It's just that his cost is no longer significant. So it doesn't really matter if you buy into Vaughn. It's more so a big deal when you get a N'Keal Harry type situation like we saw this past summer. One thing that I want to be clearer with in upcoming seasons with the 15 transactions column and podcast is where I stand when I'm selling a player. I can say sell this guy, and while I try to give context, sometimes that context gets lost. Sort of like with what happened when I said to sell James Robinson because of his tough playoff schedule. I didn't mean sell him for anything, or that he wasn't going to be valuable. I just meant that we should be down on him versus how he was performing. And you've got to then see what the market has to say, which is a crucial component as well. I feel similarly about Nick Chubb. At one point in the season, mostly because of the split with Chubb versus Kareem Hunt, Chubb was a sell candidate. Of course, I never thought that he'd be an unstartable fantasy asset. I was just concerned about where he would go this season, given the splits were more dramatic with Kareem Hunt earlier on in the season. And that logic wasn't necessarily wrong. If you look at Chubb's year-over-year numbers, you'll see that he averaged a little over 1 more point per game in PPR formats in 2020 than in 2019. But meanwhile, his running back rush share and overall rush share, they dropped pretty significantly. Last season, Chubb handled over 83% of the team's running back rushes. This year, when you prorate what he did because he missed time, that number was just under 60%. And his target share this year was significantly lower. The difference was touchdowns year over year. Chubb scored 4 more touchdowns this year than last season, and that was in 4 fewer games. Based on a formula that I use for touchdown regression, Chubb outperformed expectation by 3.9 this year. Last season, he underperformed by 3.8. There was some reason for Chubb doing so well in the touchdown column, of course. The Browns were better offensively, and the scheme itself helped Chubb. But Cleveland also had a lower than average pass to rush touchdown ratio this year, and that's a number that generally regresses. And even with the context of where Chubb got his touches, he still outperformed touchdown expectation. I think we can maybe expect that to some degree year over year in this offense, but not to this degree. But recommending Chubb as a sell early on, regardless of his injury, it was a bad call. You likely didn't get enough in return if you sold him. With that being said, I'm not that upset about the call itself, because I think there was plenty of logic baked into it. There were different points of the season where I was far too bullish on the Eagles' pass catchers, most notably Jalen Reagor, but I also liked Travis Fulgham as a buy at one point in the season as well. A couple of things happened that resulted in those takes just being so far off. One was that the Eagles just never got things going offensively. From weeks 1 through 8, which was before their bye and conveniently halfway through the season, Philadelphia was 6th to last in yards per drive and 3rd to last in percentage of drives that ended in a score. That's not great. But through that point in time, Philly had faced Washington, they had the Rams, they had the Steelers, they had the Ravens. They didn't have a cakewalk schedule. Through the rest of the season, things looked pretty good. The Giants, the Browns, the Seahawks, the Packers, the Saints, the Cardinals, the Cowboys. Most of those teams you'd feel pretty comfortable starting your wide receivers against. The issue is that, number one, the offense just kind of died. They didn't get a whole lot better offensively aside from a couple of spiked weeks with Jalen Hurts. Travis Fulgham also stopped finding the field as much as he was when the Eagles were banged up at pass catcher. That was a miss on my end to think that he'd be on the field no matter who was healthy. Rational coaching to me said that he would, but he wasn't. From his breakout game against Pittsburgh through week 11, he was playing at least 80% of the team's snaps per game. That number dropped to well below 40% through the rest of the season. And Jalen Reagor just didn't live up to the hype as a prospect. My model liked him. I liked him. I thought he was going to have a good opportunity to ball out, and he didn't. So lesson learned here. Don't overstate schedule. Don't lose sight of where players come from, like Travis Fulgham, and really just don't make too many assumptions. I think there were just a lot of assumptions being made about this Eagles offense, about the schedule, and about these players. It wasn't a terrible miss because none of those guys were expensive to acquire or get off the waiver wire, but it's at least something to call out. Now, I got plenty wrong this year. It would take me forever if I went take by take and showed off the ones that I got wrong, especially if I looked at the start-sit thoughts that I had on the matchup show each week. I've got to stop things somewhere, though. And I'm going to end talking about my bad takes this year by talking about David Montgomery. David freaking Montgomery. Entering the season, David Montgomery was borderline on my do not draft list. I actually didn't mind him that much as a prospect. My model didn't either, but I wasn't exactly blown away by his rookie season. I don't think any of us were. And in a projected bad offense where he could be limited as a receiver, he seemed like the typical player who was bound to probably meet ADP expectation, but not far exceeded. In other words, I couldn't see a high ceiling for David Montgomery, and I try to only draft high ceiling players. Things definitely broke his way this year. The Tariq Cohen injury being one of those things. We can't assume that Montgomery would have gone from a 6.2% target share all the way to an 11.4% one had Cohen been around all year. I don't think that's fair. And Montgomery ended up almost doubling his raw targets this past year, and he more than doubled his receptions. Don't understate the Tariq Cohen factor when evaluating David Montgomery. Now, with that being said, he was a better runner this year than last year. His yards per carry was up, his success rate was higher. We all saw with our own eyes that he looked more elusive on the field. But look, guys, David Montgomery wasn't great. He wasn't some RB1 until the final stretch of the season when he played Green Bay, Detroit, Houston, Minnesota, Jacksonville, and Green Bay again. When it was all said and done, all of those teams were top 7 teams for running backs when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. Before that stretch, Montgomery was averaging 12.2 PPR points per game. Before that stretch, he was the RB26 in points per game. So yes, I definitely missed on Montgomery. I didn't see that ceiling coming. But the schedule, the Tariq Cohen injury, and honestly, a little touchdown fortune too, since he scored 1.3 touchdowns per game during that crazy stretch, all of that makes me cool with missing on David Montgomery this year. I'm going to be thankful for not drafting that type of player with his situation and profile 9 times out of 10. It's just that 1 out of 10 hit. And that's going to happen in this high variance game. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll be back in your ears on Friday with the weekly Mailbag Show.